This brief discussion of chapters 1, 2, and 3 should give you a brief overview um, of the first three introductory chapters. The first chapter being more about scarcity and choice, focusing on opportunity cost and the production possibility curve, and then chapters 2 and 3 being more about the supply and demand model and the analysis there. But just briefly, I wanted to go over just a few of the key points to make sure you're comfortable with these chapters as we move forward. I'll also be posting some solutions on Blackboard to some of the key questions that I've assigned to you out of these chapters, so also look for those. In chapter 1, it's basically an introductory chapter where you're just talking about some basic terms, micro versus macroeconomics, the idea of economic thinking.
Chapter 2 is getting into graphical descriptions of that.
Opportunity cost, positive versus normative economics. The key thing there in chapter 1 is to focus on the concept of opportunity cost and how we can graph those out. If you have your text available, where they're discussing production, opportunity cost, and graphing on page 9, there's a good graph about compact cars and minivans that really gives a good discussion and analysis of how you graph those out if you're trying to get a what's known as a production possibility curve. And then the next few pages goes into the whole production possibility model, which should give you some insight into trade-offs that occur between two goods. And notice that there's no prices involved there. The goods are only priced in terms of the other goods. And then there's some connection to economic growth. A key concept there is the law of increasing opportunity cost. So again, that model is important, and be sure that you read through that. I would also recommend on page 16 that you pay special attention to the Economics in Action of Adam Smith, father of modern economics. That's a good section. The appendix, or the Exploring Further 1.1 in chapter 1, introduces you to some basic graphing, so you also need to have some basic knowledge of graphs as you move forward. Positive slope, negative slope, shapes of curves, and so forth. So while chapter 1 is an introductory chapter, chapter 2 and 3 are really the core, the introductory core of microeconomics in terms of the supply-demand analysis. So you need to go through, understand the concept of markets, understand the concept of demand. Be sure you can separate out change in demand versus change in quantity demanded. You should understand the law of demand and how we derive the demand curve from that. And if we're talking about a change in quantity demanded, then that is a price determinant, and we only move along the demand curve. If you're talking about a change in demand, then external factors change apart from price, and they're listed in our book, and you get a shift of the demand curve. So be sure you're comfortable with the reasons that we move along the demand curve if price changes, and if the demand curve is going to shift, which means price is constant and other factors have changed. And then you get a very similar discussion in supply. What is supply? How does the law of supply determine the shape of the supply curve, which is upward sloping or positive, which the demand curve is downward sloping or negative. And be sure you can separate out the change in quantity supplied versus change in supply. Change in quantity supplied means you move along the supply curve, price has changed, but change in supply is when price is constant and other factors change that shift the supply curve. Then once you're comfortable with supply and demand curves and the reason you either move along those or shift those, then we can put the two together and understand the market. The market then gives us the concept of equilibrium. Equilibrium price and quantity is not necessarily where prices and quantity will move toward, but it's simply a potential point where things could exist where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied at a given price. if you move price too high in a market, you're going to end up with an excess supply or surplus. And if you move prices too low in a market below equilibrium, you're going to end up with an excess demand or shortage. So be sure you're comfortable with those concepts. Chapter 3 is an extension of Chapter 2, supply-demand applications, and specifically it talks about price elasticity of demand. So be sure you're comfortable with price elasticity of demand, what constitutes an elastic or an inelastic demand, and then they also talk at some length about unit elastic. So on page 59, you should feel comfortable with that. There's an equation given to us. Elasticity of demand coefficient is the percent change in quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price. What that tells us then is a good is elastic if the elasticity of demand coefficient in absolute terms is greater than 1, inelastic if it's less than 1, unit elastic if it's equal to 1. So be sure you're comfortable with elasticity of demand coefficient, how to calculate that. It also talks about some determinants of elasticity and also the impact of total revenue on elasticity. Basically, if price goes up and total revenue goes up at the same time, then the elasticity is inelastic. If price goes up and the total revenue goes down, then the elasticity is elastic. If price has no impact on total revenue, then the good is unit elastic. So elasticity is a good discussion of some of the details around the market system, specifically in demand. The end of Chapter 3 does talk a little bit about government mandates, specifically what if the government mandates a price above equilibrium or below equilibrium. These are price controls known as price ceilings and price floors. So be sure and look at those. The examples usually given are rent ceilings or rent controls that mandates a maximum rent that can be charged to tenants. This typically results in a shortage because price is below equilibrium. The other example that's often used to talk about price controls is the minimum wage, and it's often thought that the minimum wage is a price floor, a price floor, that's right, a price floor for wages, because it puts prices, it sets a minimum legal price for wages, and it's oftentimes thought that results in a surplus of unemployment. These first 3 chapters are important. Recall we are going to skip the next 3 chapters, and then after Chapter 3 we're going to move directly over into Chapter 7.